Authority doesn't come from a rank, Kaladin said, fingering the spheres in his pocket. Where does it come from? From the men who give it to you. That's the only way to get it.
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Hello everyone, I'm Adam. I'll be the Ardent today, and we are talking about Way of Kings, Chapter 14.
I'm Liz, and I'll be today's Worldsinger.
And I'm Elle, today's Veristitalian.
Okay, for my world singing today, I wanted to tell you about one of the things that is my Roman Empire. You know how they say that people are always thinking about the Roman Empire? Mine is a little more expansive. One of the things that I think about idly is, why do revolutions happen? And why do some succeed and some fail? I am not a historian. I am not at all equipped to answer this question, but I like to think about it a lot. And one in particular I'm always interested in is, of course, the American Revolution. Selfishly, I'm an American. I find it so interesting how these people came together and were able to convince people to follow them and rebel. And probably my favorite portrayal of the American Revolution is the best musical portrayal of the American Revolution, which is, of course, 1776. Not Hatton, guys. I love 1776, and I don't care if it's cheesy. But the thing that I find really fascinating about 1776 is its portrayal of John Adams. And I know some of the things that it portrays about John Adams are factual. I have read David McCullough's biography of him. But it's interesting that the main conflict of the first half of the musical is that John Adams is someone that nobody likes. And so even if he is correct that they should rebel against England, nobody is ever going to listen to him or let him propose it in Congress. And so he has to get someone else, someone with more charisma and more Southern gentility to propose it in order to get this done. It's an interesting look at the way authority sometimes works in politics, right? That it's not about who has the best ideas. It's not about who had the idea first. It's about who has the influence to get it done. And sometimes that comes from irrational things like, we can't stand the sound of your voice, Mr. Adams, and so we're just not going to listen to you because you're obnoxious and disliked. So that is my world singing. I will not sing to you the song about Mr. Adams, but there you go.
I would like to add in here that my favorite portrayal of the Revolutionary War is the animated show Liberty Kids. And I just wanted to add that.
Do love Liberty Kids. Liberty's Kids is amazing.
So I have today's Storm's Eye view, and I have yet another heraldic for y'all. Kaladin orders Bridge 4 awake and to form ranks outside. He drags Moash out, demanding that everyone train for runs. They refuse to do more work when they could relax. Instead, Gaz overrules Kaladin's authority and the bridge crew leaves. Kaladin insists on his full pay and then bribes Gaz. Syl promises to watch Gaz after he argues about rank. Unable to encourage by punishment, Kaladin practices by running by himself. Carrying a heavy plank, the other bridgemen watch in amazement. Syl understands she is changing and cares about keeping promises. She realizes she almost poisoned Kaladin, but he was grateful.
You mentioning heraldics briefly reminds me that in the archive of Leading Edge magazine, which is a magazine that Brandon worked on, there is a poem about koloss that someone published, which I always think is a fun little factoid that is in this one random issue. I don't even remember the number of the issue. I could probably find it. Maybe we'll put it in the show notes. I'll find it for y'all. But it's and it's funny because the thing that I remember most about it is there's a little footnote that says Brandon Sanderson agreed to me being able to write this poem about koloss. But for the uninitiated, Leading Edge magazine was a magazine that Brandon worked on, and that's where he found a lot of his friend group before moving on to being what he is today. And he brought a lot of those people with him into his current company. Anyway, little Brandon lore there. But let's move on to our conversation about our theme this week, which is the theme of authority. And I want to focus us in on just like a close reading of the Kaladin's view of authority, especially with that opening quote that I gave, right? Where Kaladin puts forth an argument. And I want to do something that I always do with my undergrads, which I always ask, do you agree with what this person is saying? Do you disagree with it? Or is there a different way of viewing it, right? Because in my undergraduate classes, it's always about like, we have the text before us, and it's a text that's from usually a feminist scholar, and feminist scholars can be a little spicy, right? And you don't have to agree with them, even though you're reading them in a class. And so Kaladin's idea here, right, is that authority isn't from a rank, it's not from a hierarchy. Specifically, it's from the men. And I want us to focus in specifically that he says the men, right, who give it to you. That's the only, and focusing in on that word, only way to get it. Do we agree with Kaladin's approach to authority? Do we agree that that's the only way toward authority, or what are our thoughts on that?
So I am going to bring up what I put in the document in the comment because I think it's relevant. I think it's interesting. 3 years ago, I started doing some research on the Gospel of Mary, which is an apocryphal book of the New Testament. And I was reading a really fascinating commentary on it. And I will provide that in the show notes. But one of the central issues that comes up in this work is the issue of authority. And Mary Magdalene in this work is considered one of the apostles. And Christ gives a vision to Mary. And after Christ has left the apostles, she tells this vision to the disciples and is teaching them. And after she's done teaching them, Peter is like, are we sure we should be listening to her? Like, this seems really kind of silly. And Andrew steps up and says, well, yes, she has authority from Christ. Christ gave her this vision and gave her the authority to teach to us. And that kind of ended up triggering kind of a whole examination of what authority means in Mormonism, because I saw a lot of connections between the Gospel of Mary and Mormon doctrine, and like what it means for authority within the LDS Church and how that's changed over time. Even within the last 20 years, wrote a whole article about it. But I think that the Gospel of Mary itself brings up very similar questions of who is given authority. And I think to some extent, authority is granted by the community and who they are willing to listen to and who they are willing to take direction from. And I think there can be people outside of a hierarchy that have authority in a different way. So like there are people outside like the LDS hierarchy officially that have authority in different spaces, whether that's queer spaces or feminist spaces. They have authority because those communities have said, we're willing to listen to you about these issues. And it may not be specifically, we are going to have you be our authority in regards to telling us whether or not we can attend the temple, for example, or hold a temple recommend, but you have authority to talk to us about how to bring feminism into church spaces in a way that's helps other people get on board with feminist thought kind of thing. So I guess I'm saying I disagree with Kaladin. I don't think it's just men, and I don't think it's just the men above you that would give it to you.
I think it's interesting to think of this quote in the context of the Spren bond, right? There's a certain like licensing of authority that they get from each other in that bond, which is interesting. It is this relational authority to use these powers based on do I accept your oaths? Do I think you're keeping the things that you said you would do? So that's interesting.
I think that goes back to some of the arguments you made in the article you wrote about Brandon's book being the most Mormon fantasy book out there, right? Where you were talking about covenant and keeping in that.
The most Mormon magic system, let's go.
But I mean, well, like from a Mormon valence, right, the idea of covenants always comes in when it comes to authority, the idea of being authorized to pull on that Gospel of Mary example, right? Because like in the Gospel of Mary example, you are pulling L on how Mary needs to be given the okay from the community around her that she has authority, while also being authorized by the true authority, right? And so there's this tension there that I think comes out really well in this chapter when it comes to not only Kaladin trying to first vest his authority over his men, he also went and gained the title, right, of bridge leader, which means that he doesn't fully believe what he's saying here, right? If he wasn't given that title from Gaz, if he wasn't given that authority from Gaz, he wouldn't have never stepped up, right? And so there's this thing about authority here that's a little bit more intense. Like I think at the basis, right, to have a community, to connect with the community around you, you do need the buy-in of the community, and you do need the person asserting authority over them, as Kaladin's pointing out here. But at the same time, Kaladin doesn't go about that way technically, right? He goes to Gaz and he says, hey, Gaz, can I go be the bridge leader? And he needs that title in order to have that authority over them. He doesn't just stand up and say, okay, brothers, let's go carry this bridge. It's first, I need to be in a space of authority. And then, of course, Gaz says, no, you only have authority on the battlefield rather than at home. And there's that tension there. But there's this interesting space of like being authorized to do something, but then this grassroots idea of authority that Kaladin's trying to play on when he's talking to Syl about where authority comes from.
I think it's also interesting that another way he doesn't believe his own words at the beginning of the chapter is the way he tries to exercise his authority once he has this title is first by violence, right? He punches Moash in the gut. Then he threatens them and says, I'll do the same to each of you if I have to. And then he makes demands of them and says, okay, there's no more sleeping in. He's not asking for their buy-in. He's not asking for them to be interested. He's not building relationships with him. He's trying to go about getting them to listen to him and to obey him via these methods that aren't that direction, right? That are totally different. And it's so easy to fall into that method of authority because it's simple. It's easy. Especially, I've seen that from myself in weaker moments of parenting, especially when you're parenting like a 2 or 3 year old and like they super don't listen. And you just want, like, you have the physical ability to pick them up and move them places. And it's so easy to fall back on that. But it only works temporarily. And it's much better if you can figure out a way to get buy-in. But it takes more work. It takes building relationships. And it's going to take Kaladin a long time to build relationships with some of these people to get them to give him that authority that he says he wants.
I think that ties back to some of what we were talking about in the Mormon moment last episode, talking about the idea of violence creating more violence. And the idea that if your authority is based in violence, then like people's response to your authority is also going to be based in violence. And we kind of see that, like, it's not as physically violent back to Kaladin in this instance, but it's like emotionally violent in how they're rejecting him and how Moash rejects him. Like Moash, his like first reaction is, well, I'm going to call it out to Gaz, and Gaz will reject Kaladin because I know Gaz is not going to stand for this. And that's something that immediately undermines Kaladin in a very strong way. And I think that that's just interesting to try to tie back to, like, what do you do to try to get authority if you think you should have authority? Or, like, should you let authority just be placed on you? Like, in the LDS Church, you are voluntold, kind of. Like, you don't generally seek after positions. You can kind of, to some extent, request low-level positions, or you can suggest. So for example, I have suggested to my leader, hey, I have organ skills. I think I would be a good organist. But he does have ultimate authority to choose to call me to that position or not, and has currently chosen to not call me to that position. And even the higher ranks, we just had a new apostle called, so one of the highest 15 guys, because they're all guys, at the level of the church. It's not something that people applied to and asked for and said, hey, I would make a good apostle. It was, the main leader of the church, the prophet, the president, is going to choose and make that choice and then ask someone to become the new apostle. I don't know where I was specifically going with that, but those were the things I was thinking about.
I think that pulls on a sense of background of authority, though, since in Mormonism, I'm not fully bought on the idea that an apostle doesn't necessarily put his name forward, right? He puts his name forward by acting in a way that allows him to be an apostle at the very least, right? And I'm sure there's also other conversations that happen, right? And the call is offered, right? And so that in and of itself is a sense of taking on that authority and saying, yes, I am willing to step up to this. It can be a humble sense, but I don't think we can fully invest that in a humility, right? Just as in here with Kaladin, he's not humbly approaching this calling of being the leader of everyone. He's never ever quite done that, right? He does it for somewhat of a very selfish reason. I don't want any one of you to die because I can't handle that. As me as a human being, as Kaladin, I can't handle all of you dying, right? He has this like thing that it's reading these layers to it, right? Where it's like it's selfish in some ways because he can't handle the dying. It's also unselfish because not wanting other people to die is an unselfish act at the same time, right? And so there's this tension of like him stepping forward and saying, I have authority over this group, just as he did in his, just as he does over his brother, just as he does over his, the people who die under him whenever he's a med student or the med like intern of his father, right? They don't all die under him, but like there's a stepping forward of authority over that, right? Where it's like, whenever you get authority, it's not just because it's given to you, it's because you also have to step into it, right? And so I think always thinking, for me, it's me troubling kind of the Mormon sense of it, where it's like, I don't think whenever you're getting a calling, you quite have just waited for it and then it's come to you. There's always been a sense of you're living in a certain way, and so you're okay to accepting that. And I think it's a really simplistic reading of that complex relationship of a community. But at the same time, it's a sense of like, if authority is not, like, there's a sense of authority given and then authority taken. And I think every space where you gain authority over a certain group, there's always a sense of it's given to you, while also you have to step forward and take it. To relate it back to the Gospel of Mary that you brought in the beginning, Elle, Mary in that gospel is stepping forward because she says, I was authorized by Christ to do this, while at the same time asking the community of apostles to say, please accept my authority as I'm telling you that this happened. Just as Paul does the same thing in the New Testament, right? Christ comes to him and then authorizes him to go do some things. And then he steps forward and says, please accept this authority. And so there's this tension of being given authority, but also stepping forward into authority that I think comes out of this chapter and of, in general, the idea of being authorized or gaining authority.
And I think an interesting point in this chapter is Kaladin is struggling to gain authority over the bridge crew, but at his lowest moment, when he realizes he has basically no authority, he can't force them to do anything. He can't punish them if they don't do anything. He can't convince them to do anything with his high-minded idea of let's save all of us. What he does instead is steps forward and takes personal authority for his life. And he decides to go train by running with this plank of wood. And I was really struck by this sentence that he says, it felt surprisingly good to wear himself down in a way that he chose. And so even in these circumstances, it reminds me a lot of Viktor Frankl, right? Man's Search for Meaning, that like, even though he is a bridgeman, he has no control over his life. He's going to be put up as bait for Parshendi arrows. But he has the choice to say, okay, now what can I do? What I can do is train. And I'm going to choose to do that. because it's all that I can do. And by choosing to take responsibility and authority for himself, like that makes him feel so much better than like sitting around and feeling helpless, which is what he's been doing.
I love that so much. And I'm so glad you took us to that space. Okay, so I want to focus on one more part of the chapter, if that's okay with everyone. And it's the part that we mentioned at the beginning, right? The nail bond and the connection of the Spren to the people. And I want to think a little bit more about that authority figure, specifically through Syl's declaration near the end of the chapter. So Kaladin has asked for all of his spheres from Gaz. Gaz tries to give him the spheres except for the sphere that Gaz has been promised. And then Kaladin says, give me all the spheres. So Gaz gives him all the spheres. Then he gives one back to Gaz. And then Syl later on says this, I have decided, Syl declared, that I'm glad you kept your word to Gaz, even if he is a disgusting person. And what do we think about that question? I think, Liz, you brought it up earlier about the authority within the bond. Because here we see the beginning of Syl's bond, really, right? The decision of like, I'm glad you kept your word. I'm glad you didn't break an oath. I'm glad you kept honorable, right? She's here, I think this is a really clear moment of her declaring in a way that she's on her Spren without declaring that she's on her Spren, right? I would kind of place probably the beginning of the bond around right here in this moment when not only has Cal put forward the action of being honorable, but Syl has accepted that honor, right? And so you kind of see the bond forming. So what do we think about this idea of authority in relation to this bond that is like 100%, right? This relationship and connection between.
I'm thinking about actually like the moment where the bond starts to fray and like nearly fractures in Words of Radiance, where Kaladin is making decisions that are not honorable, and he is torn between promises that are diametrically opposed. And Syl kind of, despite her desires, has the authority to essentially revoke Kaladin's powers. And that they end up having a lot of conversations over how do we decide what's honorable? Because I don't feel like it's honorable to kill Parshendi anymore, Kaladin says at one point. But Syl is kind of still okay with it, but she's like, I don't know what's honor. Like, how do we decide what honor is? But in that crucial moment with Kaladin, when he was trying to decide between these two promises, Syl does have the authority to make that decision, and like has to struggle with the fact that she has the authority that she doesn't really want to have. And I think that I'm thinking more about like what authority does Kaladin have then in the Spren bond, because Syl has so much authority over saying what is honorable and what is not, to allow Kaladin to do the things that he can do. So is there a level of mutual authority here? Can there be a level of mutual authority here? Or beyond Kaladin saying, yes, I'm going to agree to do these things, I'm going to choose to do these, I will. And is that even a level of authority?
There's so many interesting layers to bring to this question with later things in the books, right? Of course, I'm thinking of Szeth, like, taking the fifth oath and being like, no, Spren, you are wrong, and I'm going to take this oath, and it works, which is really fascinating, that he's able to basically override the authority of his Spren in that case. But it's also interesting thinking about how, yes, there's maybe like, there's shared authority between the Spren and the Radiant, in the Knights Radiant, but then thinking about the brands of the fused, right? And the way that they get power is not bound by any particular code of action, except for that you accept the authority of Odium, right? I choose to follow you and I get power, and that's it. Like, it doesn't matter how I use that power as long as it's not against you. which is really interesting. So compared to that, I think this feels more like an equal partnership or relationship that they discover together and move towards. But it does have some complexities in it. And I love that conversation between Kaladin and Syl trying to figure out what is honorable and how do we follow the things that are honorable if we're not sure what they are.
I think it invests a lot a central authority within yourself at the same time, right? Syl here, I have decided that I'm glad you kept your word to Gaz. She's declaring that she has authority over that ability to decide. It's a very self-determinable authority, right? In this bond, it's the Sprin saying, I can make this decision. It's the Radiant saying, I have made a commitment to this ideal that I want to follow through with. And I don't, like I said a little bit that it's like 100 earlier, or like viewing it a little bit through a more equal sense, but I think that it positing it as equal doesn't quite fit the text itself, right? Positing it more perhaps as a complex relationship, as we all have more complex relationships than something that is good or evil or, bad or great. And I think here we get a hint at that, since the I have decided is that declaration of authority. But then she's not deciding that what Kaladin did was honorable. She's just deciding that she's glad that he kept his word. So she's learning her own boundaries. And it makes me think a lot about how going through law school right now, it's a lot of like trying to learn what the boundaries are and the authority of the community and of the society that we've built up over the last 200 whatever years. We invoked, of course, 1776 at the beginning. And so it's figuring out what authority people have to interact with the state and what authority does the state have over people. What protections do we have? Things like that. And I think that plays out well across the series of books from Brandon is what are the limits of these things that we commit to? What are the fallbacks of our commitments? And what do we have authority over to declare what is what? And what is actually just is, right? I always have a tenuous relationship with that idea of capital T truth. I think that comes up with growing up in a very capital T truth church and then being queer, right? It creates a tension automatically when you're not fully accepted into the society. And so I always feel uncomfortable with it. But I think in these books, there's a fun play with it, right? Because there is a capital T truth, but we're never really fully declared what that capital T truth is. And I kind of love that part of it. And there is like authority in these books where it's Syl has authority over the bond, Kaladin has authority over himself, Gaz has authority over other people. But it's that complexity of it that brings out more of the thought that hopefully will come across in the coming episodes. All right, any more things to say about authority? Now, we have many more things to say about authority, I'm sure, but let's move on to our sacred reading for this episode, which I wanted to do a first oath reading specifically through the part of the first oath of strength before weakness. And I'm curious if we can each think of just a space where we see a form of strength before weakness or something that informs our approach to this oath. Really thinking through, is there a way that we can complicate our thought process of strength before weakness with this chapter? Is there a way that we can, it's not a fully a real word in my own dictionary, but complexify our view of strength before weakness? Is there anything that stood out for you when you were reading through it and thinking about it and that relationship to it?
One of the things that I thought of first, like with specifically this part of the reading, was a verse from the Book of Mormon. It's Ether chapter 12, verse 27. And if you did any scripture mastery as a youth, you are probably familiar with this verse. But the verse reads, and I am going to gender neutralize it because I like to do that when I can. It says, and if people come unto me, I will show unto them their weakness. I give unto people weakness that they may be humble. And my grace is sufficient for all that humble themselves before me. For if they humble themselves before me and have faith in me, then will I make weak things become strong unto them. And one of the like interesting elements of like analysis of this verse is one of the surface level readings is often a reinterpretation of weakness as weaknesses, of like, I am bad at X, Y, or Z. So that is the thing that I'm weak at. So I have been given that weakness so that I can be humble before God regarding that thing, and God can make me strong in that thing. But a possibly more accurate reading is focusing on weakness as kind of just the general human condition. And I think about Kaladin in here. The last time we saw him was at one of his lowest points of his weakness in being human. Like, this is a thing that he is struggling with because of his circumstance. He has not gone out of his way to choose to be depressed and suicidal, but it is a weakness in him. And in choosing to take on authority, and to some extent in choosing to listen to Syl, especially at the end of last chapter, and in trusting her in this chapter, Syl is making weak things become strong. She is taking Kaladin's weakness and humanity and saying, okay, let's work together and make strength, to find strength in maybe just taking personal responsibility. Like, what can we do? As Liz was pointing out, like, he can't convince all of them to come after him, so I'm going to choose to at least make it easier for me to run. I can do that. And yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
I was thinking about probably the most striking scene for me in the chapter is that scene with Gaz, with the taking all of his money and purposely giving one back, which is, you know, the same result, right? But in Kaladin's insistence that, no, I give this to you, he's standing up for his own dignity, even though he's someone who is in a place of weakness, right? He is the one who is the slave. He is the one who Gaz has authority over. And he stands up and says, no, like, you have to acknowledge me as a person in order to receive this money from me. And doesn't let that become something automatic. And it takes a lot of guts as someone who is in that position of being oppressed and being under Gaz, to stand up and say, no, acknowledge me. And so I think I really like that as an instance of strength before weakness, because he's choosing to put his strength as an individual ahead of the weakness of his position.
I think this is all really revealing, because one thing I love about the first oath is the use of that term before. Before is such an interesting term because it could mean different things. Is it, do you have strength before you are weak? Is it, do you have strength instead of being weak? And I think what we're revealing when we pull different threads out of the chapter, right, is that there are like multiple ways to interpret what that means. For Elle, right, it's the idea of humanly we are weak, but we go on being strong. For you, Liz, the pulling out was the being strong and instead of being weak in some way. Not completely that, but like in that general sense, right? And for me, what I was pulling out from it is from the very end of the chapter. I always think there is the hidden truths of all the Knights Radiance are in those quiet moments between Syl and Kaladin, and in those quiet moments between Shallan and Pattern, when it's just the two of it's the individual and their sprint talking. And that's really where we get these more generic moments of building on what the oaths mean. It's the first oath, but also each specific oath for each order. And at the end of the chapter, like the second to last paragraph, Kaladin's answering Syl because Syl is worried about for being like going through a cycle of continually forgetting who she is because she doesn't know who she is right now. And Kaladin gives her the words that she needs, where he says to her, like, scared to go onward, but terrified to go back to where you were, or to what you were. And for me, I think about strength before weakness being, you have, it's a sense of like, you have strength instead of being weak, but it's also you have strength before you are allowed to like take a weakness in some sense of really reading that before word as before, right? To say you have strength, you are going to be weak sometime, but you have strength now. It's before that moment of weakness is you got to be strong first, right? So it's that scared to go onward, go into the where you're going to eventually be weak, but also terrified to go back. So you're having that strength by continuing to move onward, but eventually you are going to get to a form of weakness. You are going to be in a moment of weakness. And so you have to have that strength before that moment of weakness in order to fully invest and live with that weakness.
Yeah, I think the preposition you point out as a linguistics nerd, not as much of a grammar nerd, but like as a preposition before is really interesting in English. And like in life before death, it feels very obvious of life happens before death. You need to choose life before you choose death. That makes sense. And then you have journey before destination. Again, makes a lot of sense. And it is this is happening and then this is happening. It is like a timeline thing. And then you have strength before weakness, where like, do you have strength in front of weakness? Like is strength a shield against weakness? Or do you have before as in you should try to experience strength or try to be strong before you are weak? Or like, and it is just really interesting that I hadn't thought about that as much or as deeply of how complex that particular preposition is in this case. And I kind of like that the strength before weakness is in the middle. It feels very symmetrical to me in Sanderson's like continual symmetricalness in these books, where you have life before death, where the preposition makes sense, and journey before destination, where the preposition, like both of them are clear, but in the middle, kind of like the middle of everything, being in the middle of life, in the middle of a circumstance or whatever, it is messy and confusing and doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense, but it's just very nice. It feels very artistic, metaphorical, that kind of thing.
I guess I've always interpreted it as like the before between strength and weakness is the sense of that you would use the word before as in like going before the king, right? So it's like strength in the presence of our weakness. So both of them are present at the same time, right? We are all weak and we can all also choose to be strong in the presence of that weakness. The weakness isn't going away, but you're choosing to try to be strong in spite of it.
I really like that reading.
I do too. I think what I'm trying to get with the before reading and what I'm trying to posit and kind of build here is how all of the oaths are continuums. So like we can read it with the like life before death and journey before destination being very chronologically linear. But I think as well, like there are different forms of death, right, that you can take as you're living. There are different forms of journey that you take as you get to different destinations. And so I think what I'm trying to pull on here is a sense that the oaths aren't 1-2s. I like Liz's reading of their in the moment of that, right? You're still journeying even when you get to a destination. You're still living even when you die because people are remembering you. Or, maybe there's a life after this life. Who knows? We'll figure out when we get there. Eventually. But it's a sense of, for me, what I was pulling out from this chapter when I was thinking about strength before weakness is how you need to have the strength before getting to the weakness. You need to have the destination before getting to, or you need to have the journey before getting to the destination. But also along that journey, there are going to be destinations. Along that strength, there's going to be weaknesses. Along the weaknesses, there's going to be strength. And along the life, there's going to be death. But also along death, there is also life. And this sense of like the before, you can flip them at all times if you're reading them chronologically, or you can see them in this like more complex relationship. And to those who are listening to the podcast, I'm using my hands a lot here and my fingers and flipping them up and down a lot. So sorry for those who are not watching the YouTube, which is the moment where we say, go to our YouTube and like, subscribe, not to take us out of our spiritual reading here. But to do the wisdom of the heralds. All right, we're going to turn then to our final segment of this episode, which is Wisdom of the Heralds, where we think about what we've discussed and think about how we're going to take it into our daily lives. Who wants to start us out?
I can. I actually have one this time that I thought about mid-episode for the first time. I was thinking about with his comment about Kaladin taking personal responsibility even when he was denied authority. And I mentioned that I haven't gotten the authority to play the organ for my congregation. And I think I've been using that a little bit as an excuse to not practice, or at least I have said, oh, I'll start practicing organ more again when they grant me this authority. And I really need to just take the personal responsibility and go out of my way to set aside some time to actually do that practice, because it is important. I enjoy it for the sake of itself, not because I can benefit others with it. So I'm going to try to make a deliberate time to practice the organ more often.
I'll go next because Liz looks like she's still thinking. Also, the video just like paused immediately when I said that, so I have no idea what Liz is thinking. But for mine, it's going back, since I invoked Liz, it's going back to what Liz mentioned about how Kaladin takes it upon himself in the moment of being denied the authority to just deal with himself. Like, he wants the authority, he wants to care, he wants to be helpful, because that's just who the type of person he is. But when he's denied that, he then decides, okay, I need to go take care of myself a little bit. Even if they're not going to do it, I need to go do it. I need to go do the right thing. And I want to take that into my daily life, thinking about whenever I'm denied something or when I come up against a wall with something, to just take that moment to come back to myself and say, like, I need to just do something for me personally in relation to this thing that I want to do, or in relation to the thing that I lost, right? Like, if I apply for a fellowship, or if something doesn't go right in the way that I would like it to go, in like the research that I'm doing, or in the things that I have authority over, or the people that I want to do certain things, and the various things that I have going on, I want to return to myself and say, okay, I can focus on me. This is all the things that are out of my control, but I can focus back on what I'm doing and where I'm at. And if I'm doing the right thing, everything else is going to work out somehow. It's not going to work out how I want it to work out, but I think it'll still work out well.
And I was making faces because I am not sure how to phrase this. This is my first semester as an actual adjunct after teaching as a graduate student. And I find myself disappointed with myself in terms of my classroom authority sometimes, because I set very clear policies in my syllabus. I try to write out things. I try to be merciful but just. And then the second a student asks for an exception, I just crumble. I just like let all these policies go. And I do kind of worry that it's not good for me and my personal authority as a professor to not hold to those policies when there's not a reason to not enforce them. Like, my students are aware, they signed up for the course, we've read the syllabus together, and I need to accept that authority that I have and hold them to the commitments that we've made to each other as participants in this course, rather than just crumbling and saying, well, I don't want to hurt your feelings by saying you didn't follow the course policy, so I can't give that to you. So I'm going to think about that a little more carefully, and how I can stand up for myself and my authority a little bit better as I continue on developing as a professor.
Hopefully none of the students are listening to that in fear now.
It's okay. This one comes out after the semester is over, so...
Briefly, I always think I do that as well in my classroom. I tell my students I'm very firm on paper, but in person, you can like make me do whatever and I will like roll over for you. But on paper, yes, you're going to fail. So I connect with that a lot.
it's really hard when you know your choices have consequences, and you know abstractly they have consequences, but then like when you're faced with the actual person, it can be hard. And I do like to be merciful to people, but I don't want to also be a doormat. And it's a lot of work for me to accept everything late all the time. So, thank you for joining us today on the Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.
Want to do the wisdom?
I always want to do the wisdom. All right. Not the wisdom like the Emmons Field wisdom to pull on a wheel of time.
I don't want to also be a doormat. And it's a lot of work for me to accept everything late all the time. So, there we go.
Is that our title for the episode? I don't want to be a doormat. And this is the bloopers at the very end.
There you go.